All right, everybody, welcome to MetroHealth today. We're pretty excited to have you guys here. This is the fill in the blank annual Northeast Ohio Ultrasound Intern Boot Camp course, whatever you want to call it. We did it here. You know, it's something that we need to do for kind of the beginning of your ultrasound or your beginning of your residency education. And then a bunch of us programs got together and like, hey, why don't we just do this together? And so for the last handful of years, we've been doing this together. And it's just been fun to get together with all the Northeast Ohio programs and just start learning ultrasound together, kind of networking and integrating as programs before we go out and just do the rest of the training for emergency medicine. So pretty excited that you guys are here. Just for introductions, my name is Matt Tabbut. I'm the ultrasound director here at MetroHealth. So my residents, you're going to get to meet me and the rest of our team a lot. For the rest of you guys, welcome. It's good to see you guys. We'll probably rub shoulders from time to time. But just as we get started, I know we have 6 programs here today. So just by show of hands, Metro CCF. All right. University Hospitals. Wonderful. CC Akron General. You guys. Perfect. Altman. Wonderful. I apologize. I forgot to put your names on this, the lunch sessions. You're very, very important to us. We love you guys. Put yourself down with the, it's on the page 2 here. The UH St. John's Summa, you're going to go with them. Okay. We just tried to roughly balance it out by numbers. So that's how we did it. So that's where you guys will go. We got through that. St. John's. Wonderful. Thank you guys for being here. And finally, Summa. Can't forget you guys. Wonderful. All right. So, just by way of introduction, what we're going to do today is just kind of this back and forth lecturing and then going to scan. The whole goal of today isn't necessarily to get you to replace your intern rotation or to make you like experts in sonography today. But what we want to do is want to get you enough of a taste of it, maybe to get you guys excited, but also show you what's possible to do down in the department so that tomorrow when you're on shift, you can go to your attendees and be like, hey, I heard this thing about ultrasound. Can we do it on this patient? And it's not a totally foreign concept. I know when I did my rotation as a resident, it was like in May or June. And so I had to wait the whole year to get any formal ultrasound education outside of this class. And so having something like this is just a good kind of wet the whistle and get things going for you guys. I know you're getting blasted with a ton of info like the next couple weeks. So hopefully something sticks. So that's the plan today. We're going to meet in here for the didactic sessions. And then we are going to break out and go to scanning sessions. If you go out this door, you can get down that hallway, or it's kind of congested in there. So maybe if you go out this door and then there's hallways here and all the way around the corner. So if you go like past like that wall with all the famous people pictures, right, and hang a right, there's 2 more rooms down there. So it's R172, R172 through R176. Diane has done the yeoman's job of just making sure that you're all in groups and teams, and she's assigned on your badge what team you are. For the faculty, she's assigned faculties that's assigned to a particular station. You'll see signage that will direct you to the station. Please stick with your group because that's how everything's organized today. So any questions before we get rocking and rolling today? No? You just want to dive in and get going? Let's do this thing. So we're going to start off with the obligatory necessary things. And when you see the word ultrasound physics, please don't fall asleep. So this is all the techie stuff. I do this lecture every year, mostly because I'm a ginormous nerd, and it makes sense to me and I like it. So, things like this, I don't understand a lot of this anymore. In high school, I did a lot of this stuff, but math is one of those things I didn't love it, but it clicked, right? And when I was a kid, I really liked knobs and buttons, and I still do. If you follow our YouTube channel and see kind of what we do, like it's just the conglomeration of like ultrasound and all like I get knobs and buttons and things I can push, and it fires me up to like make tech happen. So that's why I like this. And so I look at myself as like this knob tech guru and like, oh, sweet, I'm Maverick and Top Gun. The reality is you're sitting here rolling your eyes and you're like, no. This dude's more like this crazy Einstein guy. And that's okay. I know I accept my lot in the life. I bring this up to say, look, when we talk about ultrasound physics, it can get really deep, really, really fast. And the goal of today isn't necessarily to make you an Einstein level PhD in ultrasound physics and understand it to the degree that you'll need to maybe in your ultrasound rotation or even like a radiologist would. But I want to give you the basics that kind of undergird what you're doing so that when you get to the machine, you say, what does this button do? And then push it and you see a change. You have a little bit of a basis for understanding the physics that went into making that button do things that it does, right? So to that, with that introduction in mind, the whole key here is we're just going to try to keep it simple, right? And the time allotment doesn't allow us to get into a lot of details, so that's what we're going to do. And even if you don't like physics, you too can do ultrasound because at the end of the day, the physics is necessary to understand it, but also like you just have to get in and just do it, right? And then a lot of the magic happens when you start doing it, push the button, see what happens, and you start making clinical decisions off of that. So physics. So basically, if we boil all of today down into a nutshell, right? It is ultrasound is a graphical display of reflected sound waves. So you're hearing me talk right now, right? You're hearing the sound waves coming out of my mouth, and you're probably, if you listen carefully, you hear a little bit of an echo in the room, right? So pretend that you can filter out all of what I'm saying and only hear the echo, right? And then somehow display that up on a computer screen. That's ultrasound. We just do it in a different part of the sound spectrum. And so the way the body interacts with that sound will affect how it shows up on the screen, right? And it affects what the image that you make. And so when I said it's in a different part of the sound spectrum, you can see down here in the low frequency range, that's what you're hearing me talk right now, right? This audible range. And if you drove in this morning, anyone listen to like the radio anymore? No? One person, yes! I know there's this big like push to get like radios out of cars, and then like there's this big push like, no, you got to keep AM radio in the car because that's how like, with everything goes sideways, that's how we're going to communicate to people, like emergency stuff, right? But I know all of us are like into podcasts and audiobooks and plug it in with Apple CarPlay and all that good stuff. Sorry to all you Android users. But if you happen to tune into the radio, and maybe it's a good exercise on your way home, tune into the radio. That's up here in the couple hundred or like the 100 megahertz range. So when you tune in, like if you guys like country music, right? That's the only, the only genre that's standard across the entire country. You go anywhere in America, 99.5 is country somewhere, right? 99.5 represents 99.5 megahertz. And so what we're going to do in the ultrasound is operate in the 1 to, most of our machines will go up to like 10, 12 megahertz, but technically ultrasound can go up into the 20 megahertz when you get into the high frequency stuff. So we're going to use all of that information kind of in that range. But what's interesting is the same physics principles that allow you to hear me today, allow you to tune in 99.5, also allows this ultrasound machine to work and do the stuff that we're going to do today, right? So essentially what's happening is as I'm talking to you, as the ultrasound machine is spitting out this sound information that you can't, this ultrasound, right? It's causing a compression and a rarefaction of those air molecules, right? You don't see it, it just compresses those and it kind of spreads them out. And that is kind of produced in this wave-like phenomenon. Like we've seen this in physics textbooks all over the place. And so if you remember, kind of go back in the time machine, each wave has these properties, right? You have the frequency, like the amount of time that it takes to go from point A right here all the way around the cycle to back to point A, right? Actually, my oldest son, he and I are studying for his ham radio license. And we were talking about this the other day. We were talking about the frequency of the sound or the radio waves that happen. So how many cycles per second, how many times it goes up and below the baseline, that's the frequency. Now that correlates very, very closely with something called the wavelength, right? So as you can see, as the frequency goes up, I get more and more of those little above and below the baseline. It's going to compress the amount of space that takes to go through the whole cycle, right? That's the wavelength. And so what we can see is that the frequency and the wavelength are inversely proportional, right? In fact, the frequency times the wavelength equals the speed of sound in that whatever tissue that you're in, right? And so you can increase one, the other one's going to go down. You go take another one down, the other one's going to go back up. And where this becomes really, really important is the effects that this has on how the ultrasound then interacts with the body. So here's a little sound clip, hopefully. Nope. Supposed to do it. Right? You know this song? It's pretty annoying, right? All right, I needed to quit. There we go. It's an annoying song, but like it reminds me of like this principle. So, hey, you've been in the car, right? And you've heard, 3 cars behind you, someone playing this song or something very similar. And all you hear is boom, 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 boom. And you don't hear like the person singing, right? This illustrates the fact that low frequencies, right, penetrate far. So if, like I was talking to my son about the radio stuff, if you want to talk around the world, you have to go to a low frequency. Whereas high frequencies have great resolution. It's very pristine what you can see on ultrasound, but you lose out on some of this penetration like you'd see in that car example when you're driving down the road. So maybe if the person's right next to you and have the window rolled down, you hear what they're listening to. But if they're 3 cars down, you don't get any of that. So, good gracious. So, where this becomes really, really important is this is a cardiac transducer, right? This is a 1 to 5 megahertz transducer. So it's a low frequency for ultrasound purposes. And you can see it's very, very grainy. Now it gives you a great view of the heart, right? You can penetrate all the way down to the posterior aspect of the heart. See the pericardium right here. You can see some lung tissue around it. It gives you that great view, but it doesn't show a lot of high detailed resolution. Compare that with the one on the other side. This is probably my Achilles tendon, just because I have time in the office. Like I need lecture slides, and there you go. But this is the high frequency transducer. So the L, it's usually like the 12.5 or something like that. And it gives you a much more clean view of that tissue, right? Now, what I'm going to lose out on is this is only a couple centimeters down, right? This is my Achilles tendon, Kegel's fat down here. So I'm going to lose, like there's not, like I don't have to penetrate very far, but like if I had to, like I'd lose that ability to do it because it's a high frequency. And so this is where you have a trade-off. You have to play that trade-off and say, okay, I'm going to sacrifice some penetration to get resolution, or I'm going to sacrifice resolution to get penetration. So you have to know your clinical context, and that's where the physics kind of becomes a little bit important, right? So how does this transducer work, right? I like to think about it like a flashlight in the dark with a little bit of fog, right? So you're walking through the woods, you have that flashlight, and you have that beam of light that's emanating from the flashlight, and you can see kind of things that are being illuminated, right? And the reason why you can see it is because the light goes and bounces off of it and comes back, and you can see it in your eyes. The only difference in this scenario is that instead of me being the observer holding the flashlight, there's some third-party observer kind of looking orthogonally against that beam of light, and they can see everything down that beam of light. But everything else, applies just the same. And so what happens is as I use this ultrasound transducer, it sends out these little pulses of sound, right? And then it listens for that sound to return back to the transducer. And when it hears that sound back, it says, okay, I know I sent some pulse here. When I hear that back, right, I can know how long it took me to get that back, right? How loud that sound is when it came back, and maybe if anything changed, like the frequency, right? And all those different factors then go into play and say, okay, if it came back a little bit more quickly versus a little bit more slowly, maybe it's a little higher, okay, closer to the probe compared to farther away. If it came back and the sound, the amplitude, right, was a little bit louder than if it, the other sound, well, maybe it's a little bit brighter, right? And so you can display those things in different places. And then it's just a matter of like taking that whole, sector and just doing that across like all the pixels, right? And so that's essentially how the ultrasound image is created. Now, what's interesting is all tissues kind of can either transmit or reflect sound. All tissues also have a very different speed at which that sound will travel through them, right? And so if there's a major difference in speed, right, it's usually caused by something called acoustic impedance, but we don't need to get into that right now. But if there's a major difference in speed, that's going to cause some reflection back, right? And that's what's going to allow us to see some of that reflection. So air has a speed of about 331 meters per second, whereas most tissues, most soft tissues are somewhere in that 1540 range, slight variation around it. And then bone is like 3,000 to 5,000 meters per second, right? And so what we're going to see is that most tissues kind of have that gray scale, right? Some are a little bit more gray, some are a little less gray. But when you get to air, it's going to have this really white, hyper-reflective appearance with some like blah shadowing behind it, right? And then bone is going to be the similar. It's going to have that really bright, reflective surface and then a deep, dark, like solid shadow behind it. And so that is 100% due to the fact that these are very much divergent from the typical speed of sound in tissues, and so they reflect sound at that bone air or bone tissue interface or the air tissue interface. And we're going to see that today, and it becomes really, really helpful as we start kind of piecing together what's going on in these different images. The other thing that we need to talk about is this whole idea of reflection, specular versus diffuse reflection. This is just the way the sound is reflected back. Remember, if no sound is reflected back, there's no image. right? If there's nothing if it just keeps going and going and going, you don't see anything. That's why I just hold a probe and just black, right? There's nothing there. You have to put it on something. That sound has to go in, bounce back to the probe before you can actually see an image, right? And so when the sound gets, interacts with that tissue, it can interact in a couple different ways. One is it can hit that tissue and the sound just goes boom and like scatters, right? And some of it will come back. That's the idea of diffuse reflection. And that's going to give us kind of this, average gray, slightly variegated, appearance, kind of that speckly appearance that we're going to see in most tissues. Contrast that with specular reflector, and that's a very highly reflective surface, like looking at yourself in a mirror, right? The sound goes in, and most all of it comes right back out. In fact, the angle of incidence is the angle of reflection, oftentimes in these scenarios, and we'll see that play out, particularly as we're messing around with some artifacts when we do procedures. But that's looking like a mirror, and that's going to be a very white, highly reflective line. So things like the diaphragm. So here's an example. Most of the liver here is kind of that diffuse reflection. Goes in, boom, and then just some of it comes out. The gallstones here, right? Or this peritoneum, like the fascial peritoneum right here, that's gonna be more of a diffuse reflector where it comes in, most of that's reflected back out, and we see that in bright lines. The diaphragm is another good example. It's gonna be hidden way back down here, but that's another example of a diffuse reflector. So that's generally how images are created. Now, what happens, we all know that like reality is messier than kind of theory, right? So what happens is, we're not as smart as like the world, right? We think we know how things work, right? We just create all these structures and the models around it. And then the body's like, nah, I'm going to do something else, right? And that something else, that unexpected thing, when the body defies what it's supposed to do, is what creates some of these artifacts. And a lot of these artifacts are predictable, right? So when you see these things, you can know, okay, this is an artifact I'm looking at. You can actually almost use these artifacts from time to time to help you identify, either the structures you're looking at or the pathology or things like that. So a couple of the common ones we need to talk about is shadowing artifact. We're going to see this all over the place. So this is looking at the kind of the liver right here, but we have a rib in the way, right? So we remember, right, we have the surface of that bone is very highly reflective, right? So it's going to be bright white, but because it's bone, right, it's going to reflect a lot, and not a lot of the sound's going to penetrate, and so it's going to be shadowed, right? You're not going to have all the sound that comes in this way is going to bounce back up, so there's nothing behind it. Contrast with the sound here that just goes in, and, it keeps getting bounced back out. So it's going to create a very, very deep, dark shadow, and that's very typical of bony structures, right? Calcified structures. So it's an artifact that's going to annoy you for a while until you realize, like, I need to work with this and allow this to kind of help me say, that's what, that's a bone, and I can use that to my advantage. Contrast that with air shadowing, right? So air is going to do the same thing, but it's going to have this bright white surface, but this kind of like mid-gray, kind of looks like the static on an old TV, kind of a shadowing type appearance. Again, it's going to annoy the living daylights out of you as you're trying to scan aortas until you realize, what? I can actually use this to my advantage and say, oh, that reflects air. Now let me think through the things that have air and kind of work through the problem from that perspective, right? The other example is reverberation artifact, right? And so again, we think about this very clean, like sound goes in, sound comes out, but the reality is it's not always that clean, right? In fact, sound can bounce off of various different things. And in this situation, it's bouncing off, bouncing and sending these reverberations of the needle. So the needle's here, but it's going to send multiple of these like harmonics of that reverberation as the sound gets trapped through two highly reflective surfaces. So we see that here. We also see that in the lung. So when you're scanning, here's the skin surface. There's the pleura right there. Both of them are highly, like the probe and the pleura are very highly reflective. And so sound is going to bounce back and forth. And sometimes it gets out and is picked up by the machine and, then displayed. Sometimes it just keeps bouncing. And so we'll pick up that second or that third harmonic of the reverberation. So here's pleura. Here's a reflection of that pleura down here. Here's a reflection of that pleura down here, and a final one down here. And so, we don't have 4 pleuras in this patient. It's just that reverberation artifact that we can expect to see in this context, right? And then this last one is just an example of like little reverberations that happen inside like that at the histologic level inside the alveoli that give you kind of that beeline artifact that we're looking for in lung ultrasound. So those are a couple of the common ones we're going to run into today. There's a ton more. I don't want to elaborate on that right now because we need to go on and talk a little bit about Doppler, right? This is everyone's favorite thing because it's cool. It looks like you add color to it. But you all are familiar with this principle where you have the fire engine go by or the ambulance go by, and the pitch of that siren is higher as it approaches, and as it like leaves you, it just drops down a little. It's a little subtle there, but you know, like train horns, sirens, all these things you can as it goes by. That's the Doppler principle. As things are approaching you, the frequencies are compressed and go up. As things leave you, the frequencies are like pulled away and they go down, and so you have that pitch that changes, and we know that principle happens all over the place. And if you were to measure the flow of blood through the heart or through blood vessels, the same thing happens, right? You send a sound or send a signal in, right? That blood, that movement is going to interact with that signal. It's going to modulate that frequency either up or down based on the direction, and then send it back to the probe. And that probe will then pick up like, hey man, I sent this out at like 1 megahertz. It's coming back like a 1.5 megahertz. So something happened in there that affected that frequency, that modulated it up, right? And so the machine knows, like, you know, based on this guy named Doppler years ago when he was measuring the stars and the colors of the stars, we know that, you know, when things are moving, it affects that. And so we're going to display that frequency change as a color, right? It's going to be an overlay onto the 2D image, but it's going to be a color overlay reflecting that movement toward or away from the probe. And we can use that to our advantage to measure either qualitatively that there is movement or quantitatively how fast that movement's going. And by convention, it's displayed as like this orange, reddish, yellowish hue moving towards you and the bluish hue moving away from you. And the degree of brightness, you know, on the scale reflects kind of the velocity with which that movement is happening, right? So that's Doppler. So that's like the physics part in a nutshell. Now what we need to do is talk a little bit about how do we actually perform this, right? So it's the hard techie stuff, or the hard like nerdy stuff. Now it's just like, how do we make this, you know, kind of, we take this art and turn it into a science, something that's reproducible, right? So that we can, you know, do the image, we can communicate that effectively to the rest of the people coming behind us, and then maybe that person behind us can come back and kind of get the same image. So the first part is just a little bit of discussion regarding orientation, right? So we've set some standards for how we want to orient the probe, and this is like, we're going to teach you the standard here, and then we'll break out into the rooms and tell you all the exceptions, right? There's a couple exceptions to this. But in general, the rule is we're going to move or indicate our probe going towards the patient's head or towards the patient's right-hand side. And so how do we do that? Right? If you look at the probe, there is some form of a lateralizing indicator on that probe. Some of the manufacturers are really sadistic and they put like, you know, multiple indicators all over the place, and you have to figure out like which one's the right one. But usually there's a predominant lateralizing indicator on the side of the probe. And if you ever wonder what it is, put a little, you know, gel on the probe and then like wiggle your finger on one side and you'll see it show up on the screen, right? But that probe indicator, right, usually some dots, some lines, something or other, you'll see them, corresponds with a dot that's on the screen, right? And so I've superimposed this one just for emphasis sake, but when you look at the screens, there will always be some form of a lateralizing indicator on that image, like at the narrow portion of the sector, right? Generally speaking, it's on the left-hand side of the sector, except when you're in cardiology mode, right? Whatever is on this lateralizing side of the probe is going to be on this side of the sector, right? And vice versa, right? And so we use this to say, you know, to help us get our orientation. In fact, you know, you can basically project an image on the screen and say, okay, based on this study, you know, what's patient's left, what's patient's right, and kind of do the problem and figure it out, you know, strictly from, you know, the probe indicator and knowing the orientation or the conventions, right? And so by convention, we're going to put this probe indicator when we're in the sagittal orientation or sagittal plane towards the patient's head, right? Generally always put it towards the head. And then when we turn it transverse, because remember in anything radiologic, 2 views is 1 view. Well, you need 2 views, right? You need 2 orthogonal views. So when you turn it transverse, right, we want to put it towards the patient's right-hand side. Right? Doesn't matter where you are. You could be, you know, looking down from the head. You could be looking up from the feet. You could be on the side, but towards the patient's right-hand side for diagnostic imaging, right? So that's our standards. So what that does is in the sagittal orientation, whatever is at the top of the pie is always, always, always and forever going to be superficial, right? No matter where you are on the body, right? It could be lateral, it could be anterior, it could be posterior, but it's always going to be superficial, right? Which means everything at the bottom of the screen is always going to be deep, right? Again, you can do front, so it'd be anterior, posterior. You can go to the side, it could be left to right, it could be whatever, right? But it's always going to be superficial deep. What's the difference is what your left-hand side is going to be and what your right-hand side is going to be. And so here's our lateralizing indicator for this particular machine. And if it's in the sagittal orientation, that means it's towards the patient's head, right? Which means the other side is towards the patient's feet. So this is a AAA. We're going to talk a little bit more about the aortas later. So this is the liver. Here's the aorta. Their feet's down here. The head's up here. Does that make sense? Okay. Similarly, if we go to the transverse orientation, so again, always going to be superficial, always going to be deep, right? I'm anterior, posterior, right? That part might change, but always superficial, always deep. So that means this is the patient's right-hand side. This is the patient's left-hand side. Make sense? Still tracking with me? Have I put you guys to sleep yet? I know it's early. And we go sit in dark rooms. How sadistic. Welcome to residency. All right, now then my favorite part. Knobology, right? All the buttons and knobs. So this is one of the more complex machines. You'll see some simpler machines out there, machines of all different flavors, but they all are very, very similar in terms of the things that they can do. In fact, when I'm teaching in a different context, I usually put up a picture of like a mid-1990s, Chevy truck. It was like the ideal truck that I wanted when I was a kid. It was like, this is what I want, right? And then I put up a picture of the truck that I drive now, which is, similar, obviously like, 20 years newer, and say fundamentally the things are the same, right? They all have four wheels. They all, have a steering wheel. They have, they go forward, they go backward, things like that. But under the hood, like there's a lot more nuance and detail in my current truck because it's a 2017 as opposed to like a 1995, era truck. Right now, mine can do everything but fry an egg on the way to work, right? So machines are very much the same. Fundamentally, they do the same thing under the hood, but how much control you have at that button interface is going to be very, very different. But what I want to do now is spend a little bit of time about how do we optimize the image with the things that are always going to be universally the same across, pretty much all your machines, right? And so we're going to talk about these basic functions, these basic modes for the machines, right? So preset depth, focus, gain, frequency, and then your 2D, 2dB mode or your M mode and Doppler, right? These are the basic things, and then we can build from here over the course of your internal rotations, your time in the departments, right? So number one, the very first most important thing you can do besides deciding that ultrasound is the best thing you can do for your patient is make sure you're using the proper preset. So what we've done, the machine manufacturers have loaded a whole bunch of default presets, especially if you're here at Metro. We've tweaked some of them and made them applicable to what we want to do. And I'm sure your departments, if you're not here at Metro, have done something similar. But basically, we've taken all the different functions that this machine can do and say, okay, for the fast exam, here's the ones that are optimal. Here's the ones that are optimal for the gallbladder, right? In terms of these other things we're going to talk about. And we made a preset. I mean, you guys are familiar with the whole concept of presets and various other things, right? So it's the same type of thing, but here on the ultrasound machine. So you don't have to go in and just like start punching all these buttons and spend 10 minutes optimizing your machine. Just I am on cardiac mode, right? And boom, you're ready to roll. So the very first thing that you can do that's going to help you out is go to the right preset for the patient in the body part that you're scanning, right? After that, it's just a matter of tweaking and manipulating the image, right? And we can do it with these various different factors, whether we increase the depth of the sector, we increase or change where we focus onto, and things like that. So we're gonna look at those here. So this is an example of depth, right? And you can see as I click down, this depth is totally, in attempt to show, I clicked the wrong button. You can see down here, the total depth is changing, right? You can make structures larger by kind of changing that depth. You can, make that depth deeper so you can see kind of what's behind it. And so whatever this clinical scenario is that you need, play with it, right? You don't, certainly if what you're interested in is way up here, you don't need 24 centimeters of depth, right? If you're scanning an arm, right, you also don't need 24 centimeters, you just need a couple centimeters. So adjust it up and down to kind of fit the bill so that what you're looking at tends to fill the majority of the screen, right? There's no like best answer, but photography, like you zoom the zoom ring until what you want is mostly filling the screen, unless you want to back out and do the wide angle. It's the same kind of principle that applies. Here's an example of frequency. Nope, I'm sorry, focus. I have a similar picture for frequency, but you can see this little tick mark here is going up and down. So a lot of machines have the ability to adjust the focal zone that it's optimizing. So a little bit of a background here. The probe can do something called beam steering. Basically, on the crystal array, when things fire, it can adjust like what direction that beam's going, right? And so it's going to steer that beam kind of towards a focal point. So just like your camera, where you can turn that focus ring and optimize that point, that distance where things are mostly in focus, the probe can do the same thing with the beam steering. And so this is you telling it, hey, I'm interested in this structure right here. I don't care about this. I don't care about this. Focus it right there and give you the best resolution. Some machines don't. I know some of the older sonocytes, they just assume that the focal point is in the middle, right? They're trying to make things super duper simple, which is great. So you just put your thing in the middle. Whereas some of like the other machines, like we use the Philips Sparks, they have the ability to kind of adjust up and down on that image where you want your focal zone, right? Here's an example of gain, right? And so this is how brightly the display presents the material that it's seeing, right? So it has nothing to do with the amount of power that's going into the body, right? It has everything to do with how loud that is, like the volume knob, on your stereo. Or a better example is, we take your picture with the iPhone, right? And you have that image and you go into the adjust because you want to make it look cool for Instagram, right? And you hit that exposure and slide the exposure up and down, right? And this is exactly what gain's doing. It doesn't change or it doesn't add to like the depth, the exposure depth that you have in that image doesn't make the, add more detail to the pixels. What it does is it pulls out what's already there. It makes it brighter, makes it darker. And so what we want to do is we want to adjust that gain so it can give you kind of most things in that mid-grade. We don't wash out our whites. We don't like muddy up our shadows. Everything's pretty easily visualized. And so again, you'll get a feel for it. There's oftentimes we'll have like an auto gain button where you can hit it and say like, what does the machine think? You can adjust from there, right? This should be the frequency image. And so you can see here down in the bottom corner, I'm toggling between a PG and R setting, so penetration, general, and resolution, which stands for different frequencies. So 2 megahertz all the way up to 6 megahertz. And albeit it's subtle here, if you look carefully, you can see just a little bit of a change in the texture, like the granularity as we toggle through those. And so maybe a little subtle in this image, but sometimes it can really help you just, if you're having a hard time getting down through a tissue, just hit that penetration mode and just going to power through it a little bit better than if you do it in the resolution mode. Makes sense? Right. And so the last thing we're going to wrap up here was just a couple of the general modes of ultrasound. So most of what we're going to do today, what you're going to see, what you think of is just B mode, right? It's 2D mode, grayscale, you hit go and you're off to the races, right? That's a lot of kind of what we're going to scan. If you need to demonstrate some form of movement, right, M mode might be your friend. And we're going to talk about that in a lot of cardiac applications. But basically what it does is we shoot a line through the sector here, right there. You can adjust where that line is. And then you say activate, right? And what it does in this lower display is it takes everything that's going through this line and this line only and displays it out over time. Right? And so we can see, I'm going through the mitral valve and you can see, here's the diastolic opening, here's the atrial kick. My little pause, diastolic opening, atrial kick, right? And you can see the movement of that mitral valve as it's going through the cardiac cycle. It can be really, really helpful in certain scenarios where we're trying to demonstrate movement. We use it a lot in like first trimester OB fetal heart rate assessment. We use it a lot in cardiac if you want some cardiac output assessments and things like that, or ejection fraction assessments can be really, really helpful way of doing that. And the final one we talked about briefly is this Doppler mode, right? So you can hit Doppler. There's a few different, like 3 or 4 different forms of Doppler you can use, but essentially it activates that graphical overlay on top of your 2D image to demonstrate movement, whether it be qualitative or quantitative, of these various different structures, right? But any questions regarding the ultrasound physics part or the knobology, image orientation optimization, kind of the basic stuff?